Imagine a pathogen with a 100% fatality rate.
Right.
Like, it doesn't just make you physically sick, it actually crosses the blood-brain barrier and physically rewires your neural chemistry.
Yeah, it's completely wild.
It makes you feel intensely, like ecstatically euphoric. You feel so incredible that instead of staying in bed, you go out to a crowded party.
Exactly.
You're effectively weaponizing your own happiness to spread this disease to as many people as possible before you die. I mean, that sounds like a pitch for some dystopian sci-fi movie.
It really does, yeah.
But it isn't. That was the actual documented goal of Soviet bioweapons engineers during the Cold War.
They called it the euphoria vector. And it perfectly encapsulates the terrifying reality of what happens when boundless scientific ingenuity is just stripped of all human restraint.
It's chilling.
It really is. Because we spend immense amounts of cultural energy worrying about visible, explosive threats to our civilization.
Right, like nuclear weapons.
Exactly. We worry about hypersonic missiles, nuclear mushroom clouds, the things we can actually track on a radar. But a biological threat is silent,
Totally invisible.
completely invisible.
Hmm.
And once it's released, it is exponentially harder to contain than, well, any conventional weapon.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Hmm.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in a space that is incredibly fascinating, deeply complex, and honestly, undeniably terrifying.
Yeah, it's a heavy one today.
We are unpacking a massive stack of research centered around an intense interview with investigative journalist Annie Jacobsen.
Her work is incredible.
It really is. We're looking at her work surrounding a hypothetical scenario called biological war. Now, while the specific narrative of her scenario is a thought experiment, the foundational building blocks are cold, hard facts.
Right. She built this using real data.
Yeah, military wargaming data, historical precedents, and on-the-record interviews with former secretaries of defense, STRATCOM commanders, top-tier epidemiologists.
The goal today is to kind of strip away the Hollywood dramatization of pandemics.
Because the reality is scary enough.
Oh, absolutely. We want to look at the actual physics, the biology, and the geopolitical strategy that governs biological threats today.
We're going to examine the exact mechanisms of how these pathogens operate, some of the historical missteps of global superpowers, and the mathematical models the Pentagon actually uses to predict societal collapse.
There's a lot to cover.
It is. But the mission of this deep dive is to extract the crucial lessons from all this data. We want to transform the ambient anxiety that surrounds this topic into active, informed preparedness.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the core premise of the research, which immediately shatters how most people define biological warfare.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that when you hear the term biological warfare, your immediate mental image is probably a deliberate attack.
Like a rogue state launching a missile.
Right, a missile loaded with anthrax or, a coordinated terrorist cell releasing sarin gas in a subway.
Which is terrifying on its own. It is. And that intentional, malevolent deployment is a real concern. But in the doctrine of the Department of Defense, and in the operational protocols of organizations like FEMA, they focus on a much broader categorization. They plan for a biological incident.
Hold on, I want to push back on that a bit. How can a clumsy tech like dropping a beaker in a laboratory equal a coordinated military strike? I mean, a mistake isn't an act of war. The intent is entirely different, so surely the response would be different too, right?
You'd think so. But the Pentagon's wargaming algorithms don't factor in intent at all.
Wait, really? Why not?
Because the pathogen itself is completely agnostic to human politics. A virus doesn't know if it was unleashed by a hostile nation-state or just a sleep-deprived postdoc who accidentally punctured their hazmat suit.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess biology doesn't care about geopolitics.
Exactly. Once that microscopic agent crosses the threshold from containment into a human host, the mathematical reality of its replication and dissemination is completely identical. The intent only dictates our political retaliation.
But it does nothing to alter the biological devastation.
Right. Jacobsen interviewed this retired colonel named Tom Earhart. He spent years in the Pentagon's highly classified Office of Net Assessment running these exact wargaming scenarios.
And what did he say?
His conclusion is basically the axis on which this entire deep dive spins. He stated unequivocally, in a large-scale biological attack, there's nothing you can really do to prevent it. You can only handle mitigating extermination.
Mitigating extermination.
Yeah, let that sink in.
Not winning the war, not containing the spread, just trying to slightly reduce the absolute maximum number of casualties.
It's a grim reality.
That is a chilling admission from the people whose entire job is to protect the country. And I mean, if accidents carry the exact same catastrophic weight as deliberate attacks, we have to look at the statistical probability of an accident occurring.
We do. Which brings us to the sheer scale of the infrastructure housing these pathogens today.
Right.
The proliferation of high-containment laboratories over the last 2 decades is just staggering. We are talking about biosafety level 3 and biosafety level 4 facilities.
And BSL-4 is the absolute apex of biocontainment, right?
Correct. These are the facilities designed to study the most lethal, incurable agents known to science.
The engineering required for a BSL-4 lab is just mind-bending to me. The scientists are wearing these positive pressure suits.
Which look like spacesuits.
Yeah, exactly. Meaning if the suit is punctured, the air rushes out rather than letting the pathogen in, and they breathe from a dedicated, isolated air supply.
And the building itself is a fortress.
Right. The entire laboratory is under negative pressure, so if a door opens, air always flows inward, never outward. The exhaust air goes through this massive cascade of HEPA filters, and all liquid waste is literally boiled under pressure before it ever leaves the building.
It is an absolute marvel of modern engineering, but the problem is it is still built, maintained, and operated by fallible humans.
Yeah, humans make mistakes.
All the time. And before the September 11th attacks in 2001, there were exactly 2 BSL-4 facilities operating in the United States.
Just two.
Just 2. Today, depending on which ones are actively commissioned at any given moment, there are between 15 and 17.
That is a massive jump. And when you zoom out to the global picture, it gets even more precarious. There are roughly 3,500 BSL-3 labs worldwide.
Yeah, 3,500.
Now, BSL-3 isn't quite the positive pressure spacesuit level, but these labs are still handling incredibly lethal airborne pathogens, right? Like tuberculosis, the plague, various hemorrhagic fevers.
Exactly. And we have 3,500 of these facilities spread across 110 different countries.
Wow.
The source material notes that many of these are located in developing nations with very fragile power grids, or even worse, in active war zones.
So just think about the pure statistical math here.
Yep.
You have thousands of facilities, you have tens of thousands of technicians, researchers, maintenance workers, all interacting with these environments daily.
Every single day.
You have to factor in mechanical failures, natural disasters, human fatigue. I mean, in 2019, there was an actual gas explosion and fire at Vector.
The Russian BSL-4 facility.
Yeah, that massive facility in Siberia. So over a long enough timeline, an accident isn't just a possibility. Statistically, it is a mathematical certainty.
It really is. And when that mathematical certainty inevitably resolves into a real-world breach, what dictates the survival of the surrounding population is the specific biological profile of the pathogen that escapes.
Right, what exactly got out?
Yeah. We all have a baseline understanding of a global pandemic after living through COVID-19, but the wargaming scenarios are looking at pathogens with entirely different mathematical realities.
The contrast in the lethality is difficult to even comprehend. I mean, COVID-19 had a case fatality rate that fluctuated, but averaged around 1%.
Roughly.
1 out of every 100 infected individuals died. And that single percentage point was enough to paralyze the global economy, overwhelm our planetary healthcare infrastructure, and fundamentally alter human society for years.
It changed everything.
Now contrast that 1% with something like pneumonic plague.
Oh, the math on pneumonic plague is terrifying.
Yeah.
It's caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and it is crucial to distinguish this from bubonic plague.
Right, bubonic is the flea bites.
Exactly. Bubonic plague is transmitted by flea bites and attacks the lymphatic system, causing those swollen lymph nodes known as buboes. But pneumonic plague is inhaled directly into the lungs.
And the mechanism of how it kills you is just brutal. The bacteria inhaled into the lungs are absorbed by alveolar macrophages.
Those are your immune cells.
Right, the cells that are supposed to protect your lungs by swallowing foreign invaders. But Yersinia pestis has basically evolved to actually survive and replicate inside those immune cells.
Which is insidious.
It really is. It turns your body's first line of defense into a Trojan horse. It multiplies rapidly until it triggers massive pulmonary necrosis, a cytokine storm, and systemic hemorrhaging.
And the clinical timeline is incredibly aggressive. If a patient contracts pneumonic plague and does not receive specific targeted antibiotics within the first 24 hours of symptom onset, the case fatality rate is 100%.
100%.
It is a biological death sentence with complete certainty.
And what makes pneumonic plague, or any of these Tier 1 select agents the CDC monitors, so existentially terrifying to the Pentagon is the vector of transmission.
Yes, the vector is everything.
Take Ebola. Ebola is a horrific virus. Depending on the strain, it kills up to 90% of the people it infects. The mechanism of death is catastrophic bleeding and organ failure.
Awful stuff.
But Ebola is primarily transmitted through direct physical contact with infectious bodily fluids. If you are standing 10 feet away from an Ebola patient, you're generally safe.
Right. Which is why, tragically, the victims of Ebola are almost entirely the immediate family members trying to care for the sick and the frontline healthcare workers.
It exploits physical proximity.
Yes. Airborne pathogens, however, utilize a completely different physical mechanism, and that's aerosolization.
Aerosolization changes the entire geometry of the threat.
Yeah.
Because we aren't just talking about large droplets from a sneeze that fall to the ground after a few feet.
No, not at all.
Aerosolized pathogens are suspended in microscopic particles, often smaller than 5 microns. Because they're so small, they don't succumb to gravity immediately.
They just float.
Exactly. The ambient air currents and Brownian motion keep them suspended in the air for hours.
So if an infected person walks through an enclosed space, like a subway car, a grocery store, an airport terminal, they leave this suspended, invisible plume of infectious material right behind them.
Like an invisible cloud.
Yes. You can walk into that completely empty room an hour later, inhale the air, and become infected. You just cannot fight the air.
It's like a shared invisible highway. We don't control who drove on it before us, making airborne pathogens an inescapable shared vulnerability. You can choose not to touch contaminated surface, but you can't choose to stop breathing.
Exactly. That physical reality is what makes an airborne pathogen bypass every conventional security measure we have. Which leads directly into one of the most controversial scientific practices in the world today.
Gain-of-function research.
Yes, because we aren't just talking about pathogens found in nature anymore. We are talking about scientists actively manipulating their genetic code in these laboratories.
So unpack what gain-of-function actually means in this context.
Sure. Gain-of-function is a subset of recombinant DNA research. In practical terms, it involves taking a pathogen and forcing its evolution in a laboratory setting to grant it a new biological capability.
To make it do something it couldn't do before.
Right. The researchers use tools like CRISPR-Cas9 or reverse genetics to edit the viral genome, and they usually target 3 specific pillars of a pathogen's profile.
Okay, let's go through those. The first pillar is virulence, right?
Yes, virulence. They manipulate the genetic code to make the pathogen more lethal. That could be by enabling it to replicate faster, or by giving it a protein structure that totally evades early detection by the host's immune system.
And the second pillar is transmissibility.
Right. For example, taking an avian flu that naturally only spreads from birds to humans and altering its surface proteins so it can easily bind to human respiratory receptors.
Allowing it to spread efficiently from person to person.
Exactly. And then the third pillar is arguably the most destabilizing.
Engineering the pathogen to defy medical countermeasures.
Yes. This means intentionally mutating the virus so that all of our existing vaccines, antivirals, or antibiotics are completely ineffective against it.
So I understand that the scientific community is deeply divided on this, so let's look at the justification. The proponents of gain-of-function argue that it's a necessary defensive strategy, right?
That's their main argument, yes.
Their logic is that natural evolution is happening constantly. Viruses are mutating in the wild, in animal reservoirs, every single second. So eventually, nature's going to produce a highly virulent, highly transmissible pathogen that jumps to humans.
It's a matter of when, not if.
Right. So they argue that by anticipating these mutations and engineering them in a lab first, we can get a head start on developing the vaccines and therapeutics we will need when the natural outbreak actually occurs.
It's essentially predictive biology. They want to map the enemy's future tactics to build better defenses today. But the counter-argument from defense experts and non-proliferation advocates is severe.
Understandably so.
Andy Weber, who spent decades in the Office of the Secretary of Defense focusing on biological threats, is highlighted in the source material as a stark opponent of this research.
And the defense expert's logic makes complete sense to me. I mean, isn't gain-of-function like giving a burglar the blueprints to your house so you can build a better alarm, but then just hoping they don't use the blueprints to break in?
That is a perfect analogy, because if you take an incredibly lethal virus and engineer it to be highly transmissible and resistant to all known vaccines, you haven't just built a research tool. You have successfully manufactured a weapon of mass destruction.
The only thing separating a gain-of-function experiment from a bioweapon is the subjective intent of the person holding the test tube.
Mechanically and biologically, there is absolutely zero difference. The opponents argue that the risk of creating a bespoke doomsday pathogen far outweighs the hypothetical reward of predictive vaccine development.
Because once that engineered pathogen exists, it is vulnerable to theft, espionage, or, as we discussed, that statistical certainty of an accidental leak.
Precisely. And the history of engineered pathogens is where the source material delves into something truly nightmarish. We mentioned it at the very beginning of the show, but we have to look closely at how the Soviet Union utilized these principles.
To understand the sheer capacity for human malevolence in this field, we have to examine the euphoria vector.
Yeah, this part is it's hard to even wrap your head around. A former bacteriologist from USANAMIZADE, that's the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, revealed that Soviet bioweapons engineers were manipulating the plague bacterium.
But their goal wasn't just to increase its lethality or its shelf life in a missile warhead, right?
No, they were attempting to engineer the pathogen to induce a neurochemical state of euphoria in the victim.
Which is insane.
The biological mechanism behind this concept is as brilliant as it is terrifying, because when a highly lethal, fast-acting virus infects a host, it usually faces an evolutionary bottleneck.
Meaning the host gets too sick to spread it.
Right. The host becomes incredibly sick, physically incapacitated by fever, pain, systemic failure. And because the host is immobilized, they isolate themselves in bed.
They aren't out mingling.
Exactly. Their lack of mobility drastically reduces the number of secondary contacts they make, which limits the spread of the virus.
Huh.
So the lethality itself acts as a natural brake on transmissibility.
So the Soviet engineers realized that if they could somehow bypass that physical incapacitation, they could maximize the spread.
Yes. The theory was to engineer the pathogen to excrete specific neurotoxins or inflammatory agents that actually cross the blood-brain barrier.
To hyperstimulate dopamine and serotonin pathways.
Or induce a state of manic encephalitis.
So the victim's lungs are literally failing. They are shedding massive amounts of this highly infectious pathogen, but neurochemically, they feel fantastic.
They experience this surge of energy and profound well-being.
So instead of seeking medical care or isolating, they go out into society. They go to a crowded restaurant, a nightclub, a transit hub.
And they unknowingly act as an extremely efficient, highly mobile dispersal system for a 100% lethal pathogen.
It is the literal weaponization of human joy. The source material accurately describes this as straight-up, dark-hearted evil.
That's the only way to describe it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it completely overrides Darwinian evolution, which naturally seeks a balance between host survival and viral replication.
Yes, this is malevolution.
Malevolution. It is science entirely divorced from morality, which forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about the scientific endeavor itself. How do highly educated people, individuals who understand the profound complexity of life, convince themselves to engineer a euphoria plague?
Well, it requires an examination of the Fritz-Haber paradox. It is the ultimate historical case study in the duality of scientific pursuit and the devastating flaw of intellectual hubris.
Okay, let's talk about Fritz Haber. He was a brilliant German-Jewish chemist working in the early 20th century.
A literal genius.
Right. At the time, the world was facing a massive crisis. The natural reserves of fertilizer, primarily guano, were running out. And without fertilizer, global agricultural systems would collapse, leading to mass starvation.
It was a true existential crisis.
And Haber solved it. He invented the Haber-Bosch process, a method of fixing atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia.
He essentially figured out how to pull bread out of thin air.
Exactly. It's estimated that half the protein in the bodies of everyone alive today contains nitrogen originating from the Haber-Bosch process.
That's incredible.
He saved billions of lives. He won the Nobel Prize. He is, by any metric, a savior of humanity.
But, and here's the paradox, when World War I erupted, Haber's intense German nationalism completely eclipsed his humanitarian legacy.
He didn't just support the war effort, he revolutionized it.
Right. He realized that the same chemical principles used to synthesize fertilizer could be weaponized. So Haber personally pioneered the development of chlorine gas and other chemical weapons.
And he didn't just theorize it in a lab in Berlin, he actively deployed to the front lines. At the Second Battle of Ypres, Haber personally supervised the release of over 160 tons of chlorine gas.
He was right there watching it happen.
He watched as the wind carried the heavy greenish-yellow cloud into the Allied trenches. He observed thousands of men drowning in their own bodily fluids as the chlorine reacted with the moisture in their lungs to form hydrochloric acid.
And he felt justified.
He was proud of this. He famously stated that in peacetime, a scientist belongs to the world, but in wartime, he belongs to his country.
The tragic irony of Haber's life is staggering, and it begins with his wife, Clara Immerwahr.
She was also a brilliant PhD chemist, right?
Yes, she was. And she was so morally horrified by his work on chemical weapons that she actually took his military service weapon and died by suicide in their garden.
That is heartbreaking.
It gets worse. Haber left for the Eastern Front the very next morning to initiate another gas attack.
He didn't even pause, and the tragedy spirals even further. Because Haber was Jewish, his fervent nationalism and his immense contributions to the German military could not save him when the Nazi Party took power.
No, they stripped him of everything.
He was stripped of his positions and forced to flee Germany, eventually dying of heart failure in a Swiss hotel.
But the infrastructure he built, the chemical institutes he founded, and the lethal pest control gases his teams developed were entirely co-opted by the Nazi regime.
They adapted his work to create Zyklon B.
Yes, the hydrogen cyanide pesticide that was used in the gas chambers during the Holocaust.
So the very technology that Haber engineered was utilized to systematically murder millions, including members of his own extended family.
It is one of the darkest, most devastating ironies in human history.
We bring this up because it shatters a very common, very dangerous assumption we make in the modern world. We tend to equate supreme intelligence with innate morality.
We really do.
We assume that if someone has the genius to decode the human genome or engineer a novel viral vector, they must possess the wisdom to use that power responsibly. But Haber proves that human intellect is a vastly powerful engine, but it comes with absolutely no built-in steering wheel or brakes.
That's so true.
The fatal flaw of humanity isn't a lack of intelligence, it is hubris.
It is the profound arrogance of believing we can unleash these forces and somehow maintain control over them. And we see this exact same hubris magnified on a geopolitical scale when we look at the historical attempts to regulate biological threat.
And treaties.
Right, the illusion that treaties and international agreements can somehow override the paranoia of nation-states.
Let's look at the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention. To set the stage for this, in 1969, President Richard Nixon made a unilateral, deeply surprising announcement.
A huge moment in history.
He renounced the entirety of the United States' offensive biological weapons program. He declared these weapons repugnant to the conscience of mankind.
And this wasn't just political rhetoric either. Over the subsequent 214 weeks, the U.S. military systematically decommissioned its bioweapons facilities.
Like the massive complex at Fort Detrick, Maryland.
Right. They actively destroyed their stockpiles of weaponized anthrax, tularemia, and other agents.
This massive de-escalation led directly to the creation of the Biological Weapons Convention, or the BWC, in 1972. It was a global treaty prohibiting the development, production, and stockpiling of biological and toxin weapons.
And the Soviet Union was a primary signatory.
Right, so on paper, it was a monumental triumph for human civilization. The world collectively agreed to step back from the biological abyss.
But the reality behind the Iron Curtain was the exact opposite. While the United States was genuinely destroying its arsenal, the Soviet Union signed the BWC and immediately initiated the largest, most sophisticated, and entirely illegal biological weapons program in human history.
Biopreparedness.
Yes, biopreparedness.
They built massive secret cities like Stepnogorsk, entirely dedicated to brewing tons of weaponized anthrax and genetically altering the plague, which really begs the question. If the U.S. had verifiably dismantled its program, why would the Soviets sign a treaty only to immediately undertake a massive, incredibly expensive illicit program?
We actually understand the internal logic of this because in the early 1990s, the first deputy director of biopreparedness, a brilliant scientist named Dr. Ken Alibek, defected to the United States.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he explained that the driving force wasn't necessarily a desire to conquer the globe. It was driven by institutionalized absolute paranoia.
It's the game theory of the Cold War.
Precisely. The Soviet political and military leadership told their scientists two core lies to justify the program. First, they argued that there was absolutely no way the United States was actually destroying its bioweapons.
They thought it was a bluff.
They believed the Nixon Declaration was a massive psychological operation, just a trick. They assumed the U.S. was cheating on the treaty in secret underground bunkers, and therefore the Soviet Union had to cheat massively just to maintain strategic parity.
And the second lie was the demonization of the adversary. The Soviet scientists were indoctrinated to believe that the West harbored such deep, virulent hatred for the Soviet people that America would not hesitate to use a biological weapon to annihilate them.
Right. Therefore, the engineers were told they were doing noble defensive work.
Defensive work.
Yeah, they had to engineer a euphoria plague to ensure the survival of their own people against a perceived monster.
Wow. It is the ultimate tragic feedback loop of paranoia. You assume your enemy is capable of unspeakable evil, so you commit unspeakable evil to defend yourself, effectively becoming the exact monster you feared.
It's a vicious cycle.
And we cannot dismiss this as ancient Cold War history. The geopolitical landscape is still heavily fractured today. The U.S. State Department issues annual compliance reports on the BWC, and they openly state they are monitoring dual-use research and programs of concern in nations like Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China.
The technology has advanced exponentially, but the underlying geopolitical paranoia remains entirely intact.
Which brings us into a highly sensitive but absolutely necessary part of this analysis. We have to look at how we, as a global society, manage pandemics in the modern era, specifically examining the institutional response to COVID-19.
This is critical.
And before we transition into this segment, we must explicitly state a core boundary for this deep dive. We are about to discuss politically charged content that is pulled directly from the source material and Annie Jacobsen's research. We, as the hosts, are absolutely not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoint, candidate, or ideology. Our sole function right now is to impartially report on the source material's observations regarding how public health communication broke down and became deeply politicized. We are analyzing the mechanics of institutional failure, not adjudicating the politics.
That boundary is essential. Because when defense experts analyze the COVID-19 pandemic through the lens of a biological incident, the most alarming vulnerability they identify wasn't the novel virus itself.
What was it?
The greatest vulnerability was the catastrophic collapse of public trust and the failure of institutional communication.
The source material highlights several stark examples of this breakdown. One of the most glaring occurred in late March of 2020.
I remember this well.
Months into the global crisis, when fear was at its absolute peak, the World Health Organization published a definitive tweet. It stated in very clear terms that COVID-19 was not airborne, and this assessment was subsequently echoed and supported by the CDC.
And this definitive statement was made despite a rapidly growing body of evidence from frontline physicians, epidemiological tracking of superspreader events, and early aerosol physics studies strongly suggesting that the virus was, in fact, highly transmissible through the air.
The institutions just dug their heels into an outdated paradigm of droplet transmission.
Exactly. And the societal result of that rigid miscommunication was what the source analysis describes as performative theater.
Yes, performative theater. Because the public was told the threat wasn't in the air they were breathing, the anxiety was entirely redirected toward fomite transmission.
Fomites being inanimate surfaces.
Right. People were leaving their mail in the garage for a week. They were scrubbing down their cereal boxes with bleach wipes.
Which is wild in hindsight. The subsequent data analysis revealed that the fear of fomite transmission was vastly overstated.
By how much?
Well, studies suggested that roughly 1 in 10,000 cases of COVID-19 were contracted by touching a contaminated surface. The vast, overwhelming majority of transmission was airborne.
So why did millions of people engage in the ritual of wiping down their groceries?
Because in a low-information, high-fear environment, humans desperately crave the illusion of control. Scrubbing a cardboard box gives you a physical, actionable task to perform to ward off an invisible, terrifying threat.
It provides psychological safety, even if it provides almost zero biological safety.
Exactly. But the wasted bleach wipes were a minor issue compared to the larger consequence.
The total weaponization of scientific data by the political spectrum.
Yes. The source material outlines how both sides of the political aisle engaged in this cognitive dissonance, basically prioritizing tribal allegiance over public health consistency.
The analysis points out that in the months leading up to the 2020 election, there were prominent left-leaning political figures and large demographics who publicly stated they would vehemently refuse to take any vaccine developed under the Trump administration's Operation Warp Speed.
They openly expressed deep skepticism of the pharmaceutical science, solely because of the political figure spearheading the initiative.
Yet, A year later, many of those same figures were instituting mandates requiring multiple boosters for their constituents.
And exactly mirroring that behavior on the other side, you had right-leaning demographics, many of whom were ardent, devoted supporters of Donald Trump, who ended up fiercely rejecting the exact same mRNA vaccine technology that his administration had championed, funded, and fast-tracked.
The political tribalism completely short-circuited the logical processing of the scientific reality.
What's fascinating here is that the root cause of this massive polarization wasn't just political opportunism, it was a fundamental lack of humility within the scientific and institutional communities themselves.
Humility.
Yeah. In the chaotic, rapidly evolving early days of a crisis, the most powerful, trust-building sentence a scientist, a CDC director, or a politician can utter is, "We do not know the answer yet, but here is exactly how we are working to find out."
But the institutions were terrified of appearing weak or uninformed. They wanted to project absolute, unshakable authority to calm the public.
And by projecting absolute certainty on complex issues, where the science was still actively evolving, like the airborne nature of the virus, the efficacy of masking, or the long-term durability of vaccine immunity, they trapped themselves.
Because when the evolving data inevitably forced them to reverse their earlier definitive positions, they didn't just look wrong.
No. To a frightened public, they looked deceptive.
Right. And once that institutional trust is broken, people immediately retreat into their ideological tribes. And once a society is fractured along tribal lines, coordinating a unified public health response becomes functionally impossible.
That fracturing of trust is perhaps irreparable.
Yeah.
And that is a terrifying reality to face if we are ever confronted by a pathogen with a case fatality rate significantly higher than 1%.
So what does this all mean when we throw the newest, most volatile, and most unpredictable variable into this already fractured landscape? We have to talk about artificial intelligence.
Oh, AI represents an entirely new frontier of biological threat. It is the ultimate threat multiplier. Historically, if a rogue state or a non-state actor wanted to build a weapon of mass destruction, specifically a nuclear weapon, they faced an immense barrier to entry.
You need highly guarded, highly regulated fissile material, like enriched uranium or plutonium.
Right. You need massive, specialized infrastructure, centrifuges, cooling towers, secure facilities that require vast amounts of electricity.
It is incredibly difficult to hide a nascent nuclear weapons program from global intelligence agencies and satellite surveillance.
But biology operates on a completely different set of rules. Biology doesn't require rare earth metal or massive industrial plants.
Biology primarily requires information and basic, easily obtainable, dual-use laboratory equipment.
Exactly. The barrier to entry for biological engineering was already dangerously low. But the advent of artificial intelligence has dramatically, perhaps permanently, lowered it even further.
The source material focuses heavily on large language models, systems like Anthropic's Claude or OpenAI's ChatGPT. These models are not just glorified search engines.
Far from it.
They have ingested the entirety of global scientific literature. They have consumed millions of PubMed papers, genomic databases, protein-folding algorithms like AlphaFold.
They possess an encyclopedic, interconnected knowledge of biochemistry, virology, and genetics that no single human mind could ever hope to achieve in a lifetime.
And this rapid democratization of complex knowledge is incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands. During her research, Jacobsen shared an anecdote where she was actually able to prompt a major publicly available LLM to generate highly dangerous, classified adjacent information regarding biological synthesis.
She actually got it to output that.
Yes, she took this discovery directly to Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, and to their credit, the company patched the vulnerability very quickly, implementing guardrails so the AI would refuse to answer that specific vector of inquiry.
But the glaring issue here is that the global security apparatus cannot rely on investigative journalists happening to have the CEO of major tech companies on speed dial.
Right. The major centralized AI companies are actively trying to patch these threats, but they are playing an impossible game of whack-a-mole.
Exactly. The sheer speed of AI development is vastly outpacing the ability of any government bureaucracy to regulate it. And the real threat isn't just the major commercial models. It is the proliferation of open-source, decentralized AI models.
The ones that can be downloaded and run locally on a private server.
Yes, completely free of any corporate safety guardrails. The existential fear among defense experts is no longer limited to well-funded rogue nations.
The script kiddie problem.
Yes, the script kiddie problem of biotech. A disgruntled individual in a basement who, guided step by step by a superintelligent, unguardrailed AI assistant, manages to synthesize or engineer a Tier 1 pathogen using mail-order DNA sequences and basic lab equipment.
Okay, so let's walk through the ultimate nightmare scenario. Let's look at the Pentagon's wargaming math. Let's say that happens. A lone actor synthesizes something horrific, or a BSL-4 lab in a remote region suffers a catastrophic containment breach. The pathogen gets out into the population. What does the actual timeline of societal collapse look like?
The timeline generated by the wargaming algorithms is arguably the most brutal part of the entire analysis. It models the transition from a functioning society to what they term outbreak to anarchy.
6 days.
6 days. According to the epidemiological models and behavioral algorithms, if a highly lethal, highly transmissible airborne pathogen is released, there is a hypercritical, intensely narrow window of exactly 12 to 24 hours.
Just a day.
At most. If global public health officials, intelligence agencies, and the military can immediately identify the biological signature of the leak, isolate the geographic area, and enforce an absolute hermetic quarantine within that first 24 hours, the dystopian cascade can theoretically be prevented.
But the logistical reality of identifying a novel threat and mobilizing a military quarantine in 24 hours is nearly impossible.
Which is why the models shift.
Yeah.
Once you hit the 24 to 48-hour mark, and certainly by 96 hours, the wargaming concedes that the pathogen is entirely out of the bag.
It's everywhere.
It has utilized modern transit hubs, airports, high-speed rail to establish multiple geographically disparate vectors of infection. It is spread beyond any hope of physical containment.
And then what?
At that point, the algorithms predict that supply chains fail, medical infrastructure is completely overrun, civil obedience evaporates, and society descends into total anarchy within 6 days.
6 days from your normal commute to work to absolute societal collapse. And this grim mathematical certainty is what necessitates the existence of a highly classified continuity of government plan that the source material uncovered. It's a protocol called devolution.
Yes, devolution. We spent a lot of time discussing human evolution, our ability to build incredibly complex, interdependent, globalized societies.
But devolution is the exact opposite.
It is the precise, engineered opposite. It is a deeply classified, institutionalized plan where, in the event of an uncontrollable biological event or total systemic collapse, the government abandons the concept of saving the nation as a whole.
Wow.
Instead, a tiny, microscopic fraction of the most essential government leadership, military commanders, and key scientific personnel are rapidly extracted, preserved, and isolated in hardened, deep underground facilities.
Like Mount Weather or Site R.
Exactly.
The structural reality of devolution is horrifying. The government technically survives to maintain the legal continuity of the state, but the rest of society is entirely abandoned to fend for itself in the anarchy. And one of the most controversial, heavily debated elements of managing that chaotic collapse is what we can call the information paradox.
This is a huge debate because in a severe cascading crisis, the President of the United States has the legal authority and the technical capability to essentially execute a kill switch on the public internet.
Shutting it all down.
Yeah. The government would sever civilian access and fall back on deeply secure, hardened, military-only networks like SIPRNet.
The rationale behind plunging the country into a digital blackout is to stop the viral spread of mass panic, right? We've seen how quickly social media platforms can amplify disinformation, incite riots, coordinate cyber attacks on failing infrastructure. They want to cut the cord to prevent a bad situation from being exponentially worsened by digital chaos.
This creates an agonizing paradox.
Because if I'm listening to this and I imagine the internet going dark during a lethal outbreak, I am immediately thinking that the blackout would actively accelerate the panic.
It absolutely might. The paradox is that while social media is a breeding ground for rumor and panic, in a fast-moving, localized biological event, real-time peer-to-peer reporting from average citizens on the ground might be the only mechanism for the general public to receive accurate, life-saving information during that critical 12 to 24-hour window.
Exactly. If the federal bureaucracy is paralyzed or slow to respond, a raw video uploaded by an emergency room nurse showing what the initial symptoms actually look like, or a localized tweet warning people to avoid a specific transit hub could save tens of thousands of lives.
Without a doubt.
If the government pulls the plug on the internet, they plunge the population into absolute darkness. And darkness doesn't breed calm darkness, breeds absolute primal terror.
It is a devastating catch-22 with no clear algorithmic solution. But perhaps the most heartbreaking truth of a biological event, the element that makes it fundamentally psychologically different from any conventional conflict, is the demographic reality of who dies first.
This specific part of the source material is genuinely difficult to process. In a war, the initial casualties are usually the combatants, the soldiers on the front lines. But in a biological event, the first victims are the first responders, the EMTs, the emergency room doctors, the pediatric nurses, and mothers.
If we connect this to the evolutionary biology of pathogens, we see a microscopic, unthinking entity that effectively exploits the highest, most noble virtues of human empathy.
They weaponize our love.
Yes. When a soldier is trained to engage a threat, they do so from a distance. They utilize cover, concealment, standoff weapons. They put space between themselves and the danger.
Right.
But a biological threat operates on the exact opposite principle. If a child is violently ill, burning with a high fever, coughing, in deep distress, a mother's biological, evolutionary, and emotional instinct is to close the distance.
To comfort them.
Driven by oxytocin and deep kin selection, she pulls the sick child closer to her chest to comfort them. When an emergency call goes out, paramedics do not retreat. They rush into the confined, dangerous environment to save the afflicted.
The very biology of an airborne pathogen requires that physical closeness. It uses our human care, our instinct to comfort the suffering, as its primary vector for transmission. It literally weaponizes human empathy against us.
This raises an important question, and it is perhaps the most profound ethical and philosophical question in the entire field of biological defense. How do you defend a society when the very traits that make us uniquely humane, our compassion, our instinct to comfort the sick, our desire to hold our loved ones, are the exact vulnerabilities that a pathogen targets?
Yeah, how do you?
If the only successful strategy for survival is to become entirely isolated, callous, and deeply fearful of your own neighbor, what kind of society is actually surviving?
There is a quote in the source material from former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, who received anthrax in the mail shortly after 9/11. He described a severe biological event as resulting in people doing inhuman things to one another just to survive. It paints a picture of a biological twilight where the only individuals left standing are the ones who are willing to completely abandon their humanity.
It is an incredibly grim projection, and that is precisely why the focus of all this wargaming, all this research, must be aggressively shifted toward prevention, early detection, and the building of a radically robust, transparent public health infrastructure.
Which brings us perfectly to the core mission of this entire deep dive. We have covered a vast amount of terrifying ground today. We've looked at the very real, statistically probable threat of biological incidents.
I've covered a lot.
We've examined the staggering proliferation of BSL labs worldwide. We've discussed the unpredictable speed of AI lowering the barrier to entry for malicious actors, and the historical hubris of brilliant scientists who mistakenly believed they could control the uncontrollable forces of nature.
But we must remind you that the goal of uncovering and discussing all this deeply unsettling information is not to induce a state of passive panic. Panic is a useless emotion. It paralyzes you.
What is the goal then?
The goal of this deep dive is pressure.
Right. Knowledge is the only thing that gives us agency. By understanding the glaring vulnerabilities in our public health systems, by comprehending the reality of gain-of-function research, and by looking honestly at the mathematical truths of pathogen transmission, we can actively demand better oversight.
We have to.
We can demand rigorous transparency from our scientific institutions and our government agencies. We can demand that safety guardrails are permanently embedded into AI development before it's too late. We do not have to be passive victims waiting for a statistical certainty to occur. We can be informed citizens pushing for actual systemic preparedness.
Exactly. The mere fact that we are capable of analyzing these threats means we possess the intellectual capacity to mitigate them.
But before we conclude today, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. It's a concept that was buried in the margins of the source material, briefly mentioned by David Relman, a Stanford University professor and former White House science advisor. It is a mind-bending, existentially horrifying concept known as mirror life.
The scientific term is chiral biology, or enantiomers.
Right. To understand this, you have to look at the geometry of life on Earth. All DNA on our planet, every living organism, from a microscopic amoeba to a blade of grass to a blue whale to the cells in your own body, has a specific structural geometry.
The physical shape.
At a molecular level, the amino acids and DNA possess a right-handedness. They twist in a specific direction. But scientists in synthetic biology labs are currently theorizing and potentially actively attempting to build synthetic left-handed DNA.
It would be a perfect synthetic mirror image of natural biology. Every component is identical, but structurally flipped, like looking at your own hand in a mirror.
And the terrifying implication of this chiral biology is how our bodies would interact with it. The human immune system is essentially a complex lock-and-key mechanism.
Right.
It has evolved over millions of years to recognize, bind to, and destroy right-handed biological threats. Because left-handed mirror life is a structural opposite, our immune system's receptors would have absolutely zero ability to recognize it.
The keys just wouldn't fit the locks.
The immune system wouldn't even register that a foreign entity had invaded the body.
It couldn't fight it, it couldn't contain it, it couldn't trigger an inflammatory response. We would be completely, fundamentally, biologically blind to it. It is the ultimate stealth pathogen.
Now connect that concept of mirror life to the sheer vastness of the cosmos. The Fermi paradox asks the famous question, given the billions of stars and planets in the universe, where is all the alien life?
It's a great question.
One of the leading theories for how life actually spreads across the galaxy is panspermia, the idea that the microscopic building blocks of life are trapped in ice and travel through the void of space on meteorites, eventually crashing into and seeding habitable planets.
Which is entirely plausible.
So I want you to ponder this. If microbes from the cosmos eventually land on Earth, what happens if the rest of the universe evolved using left-handed mirror life? We spend so much time and billions of dollars looking out into the dark, scanning the skies for an alien invasion of massive flying saucers and laser beams. But what if the real ultimate existential threat is an alien microbe that arrives on a rock, a microbe that we literally lack the biological programming to even perceive?
It forces a profound realization. The most dangerous, world-altering threats to our species are rarely the ones we can easily see coming over the horizon. They are the invisible threats, the microscopic forces that operate entirely outside of our established paradigms.
We started this deep dive talking about the clarity of X-rays, about our deeply human desire for clean lines, binary choices, visible threats, and clear diagnoses. But the reality of our biological future, whether it comes from a BSL-4 lab in Siberia, a script kiddie with an AI, or a meteorite from deep space, isn't a broken bone we can easily set in a cast. It is an invisible, infinitely complex microscopic world that we share inescapably with every single breath we take.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep questioning the world around you, demand true transparency from those in power, keep learning, and above all, stay curious.